42.
1
52.
and that is the secret of the universe. 42. That's a good place to start an episode with the secret of the universe. So, hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans, it's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just three nerdy veterans geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. So, without further ado, we're going to let our guests introduce ourselves. Although I have the impression that these two need no introduction, but we're going to do it anyway. So we'll start with you, Mr. Eric Flint. Can you tell us about yourself and to anybody who doesn't know?
My name's Eric Flint. I have written a lot of books by now. I lose track, but I'm somewhere a little over 70 novels. About half of them are alternate history. The majority of those part of the Ring of Fire series, which is what I'm best known for. And that's a series that started with 1632, which was published in the year 2000. And since then, I actually just did a count for a little essay I wrote. I have authored or co-authored 26 novels through Baen Books.
Wow.
Through our publishing house, which is our own publishing house, Ring of Fire Press, 37 other novels have been written by other people, mostly through Ring of Fire Press, some of them through Baen Books. There's been a total of 17 anthologies of short fiction published. And an electronic professional magazine has been running since May of 2007. It's a bi-monthly. And we are now up to issue 97. So it's a really kind of an enormous project. And when people ask me what's my relationship to it, the way Mozart is said to have done his music was he often played himself, of course, but he also would conduct, but he'd conduct from his own piano. And that's kind of what I do. This is a collective enterprise, not just me. I'm sort of on top of it quite well, but I'm not a control freak either. So as Chuck will testify to. So I like to give people plenty of leeway and elbow room to see what they can come up with. And partly I think that helps keep the series fresh. One thing that I was concerned about when I started this thing and decided to make it a series, long series have a tendency to get stale. It's hard to keep that from happening. And one of the reasons I think it happens is they tend to be written by one or two authors, and they tend after a while to sort of know where they're going. And I find it helpful to have surprises being sprung regularly, which happens because other people come up with ideas. And as long as they'll work, I try to fit them into the series and go from there. In addition to the alternate history, I've written a lot of science fiction, some fantasy, more science fiction than fantasy. I don't know. I mean, it's. I'm going to stop there.
All right. What about you, Eric? Who are you for people? Or Eric, sorry. What about you, Chuck? Who are you for people who don't know who you are?
My name is Chuck Gannon. I'm an author. I'd better be, or I shouldn't be on here. I write. I've written nonfiction and written fiction, and this was my first love. I knew I wanted to do this when I was 12. It took me a while and a circuitous path to get here, but here I am, and I'm not going anywhere soon, much to many people's frustration, perhaps, but there you go.
No, you're amazing.
I'm probably best known for science fiction. Most people connect my name with the Kane Riordan series. That is not in any way saying that what I've done hasn't been, for me, hugely important and hugely gratifying in the Ring of Fire series, but the bottom line is that Eric Flint's name is associated with that, and it's usually Eric Flint and some other guy or gal. That's pretty much what happens. So I'm
but there's amazing authors who've done it. Eric doesn't pick anybody who's not worth being in there. So
true. And I've yeah, absolutely. I'm doing some of the same things in that, like I said, it's mostly I'm known for hard science fiction. I have been recruited, not to say dragooned, into writing space opera, something that's more like what other people consider science fiction, and I consider veering towards space opera, which probably tells you something about my take on hard science fiction. And I've written alternate history, and I have now just in the last year, I guess you would call the Black Tide Rising series someplace between
it's urban sci-fi,
essentially dystopic alternate history. And this November, the first novel in the Vortex of Worlds series called This Broken World comes out, and
that's fantasy though, right?
That's fantasy.
I'm so excited by this.
That's epic fantasy with more than a few slipstream elements. To return, however, to only stealing from the very best, between having worked in War World back in the early 90s, which is associated with Jerry Purnell's name, but was mostly sort of, I guess you could say, shepherded and patched together by John Carr. I sort of learned a little bit about shared universes there. And then, of course, I have been working in Only the Best and Only the Biggest in Ring of Fire, watching carefully as I went. The bottom line is that there's a separate imprint at Chris Kennedy Publications called Beyond Terra Press. Beyond Terra Press is basically if it's something set in the Kane universe, you're either going to find it at Baen or you're going to find it at Beyond Terra Press. And that's because there's a lot of folks who want to tell stories in it. I guess it's kind of interesting. Maybe this is a way in which Eric and I are similar. I never really thought this, but perhaps we write the sort of stories that make other people want to jump on the bandwagon, because it wasn't me going out and beating the bushes. It was me having people come up to me and say, when can I play in your sandbox? And actually it was Eric who made the first one of those take place, which was not made, but allowed it to, which was Lost Signals, which gets to exactly what he's talking about. It's kind of interesting. Some people were concerned when they realized that I was going to open it up as an anthology and have 20 other people come in there. Mine not being by any means the longest. As a matter of fact, if you can believe it, I wrote something in my own anthology that was one of the shorter ones. And for those of you who are familiar with
I don't believe it.
Yeah, yeah, I know, right? You only published it, so you're gonna just have to go and have that sort of cognitive dissonance moment all by yourself there. But at any rate,
I know one of those people who was probably knocking on your door. Was it Casey Azell?
And the bottom line is, though, that I agree with everything Eric said about, you kind of know where the authors know where they're going, and once you figure out the author, you kind of know where they're going. That's a huge part of it, and that's why Beyond Terra Press has now sort of taken a whole new series called Murphy's Lawless, which parallels. It is not really a side series. It parallels and then crosses back and forth with the main Kane Riordan arc. And then I'm doing a collaboration with Eric called Triage. We're trading roles. He's going to be in my universe, and David Weber called Misbegotten, and those are going to probably come 2022. One will be written in 2023. The other, the thing that I really like about having the different voices is because that's like reality. There's something about one author's voice sort of framing reality that can be very, very guiding and comforting in a way, but I think it can also become almost hard to believe. It's like even if it's a very, very delicate hand of the craftsperson, you can tell it's the same craftsperson's hand. And I really like getting all those other vibes into the universe and making it feel more real, just the way the universe is, filled with different people with very different perspectives. And it's been wonderful and flattering and surprising, and that's what I do.
I
Okay.
gotta step away for like 1 minute, so you guys just keep going. I'll be right back.
All right. Well, the next part of the introduction, dear listener, is how we found them. But I actually found both of them through Cisca when we were setting up the podcast, and she said, if you want to be a real serious podcast, you have to ask real serious authors, and you
I
can't just
did
be
not.
goofing off all the time. I know, I'm just giving you grief.
I
But
said
Cisca said we've got to have these. She was bossing us around and saying that there's more out there than just the small circle of people that we knew, Chris Winder and I. And so we had Mr. Gannon on for back in the when we were still Sci-Fi Shenanigans, and we just sort of stayed in touch with all of them. And then we had them on most recently, at least with Eric, for the Dragon 2021 nomination episode. And I was intrigued enough that I bought the first book. So
that was Eric and me, I think.
Chuck was there.
You were, but that's not where I met you. I'd already known you at that point.
Actually,
no, I already
the
had.
Funny one from that episode, JR. Every author on that episode won a Dragon Award this year because it was Chuck, Eric, and John Brown, and they all won.
Yeah, you're right.
Not saying we had anything to do with it, but it is kind of cool.
But we also interviewed people that didn't win, so that's just sort of hindsight bias on your part.
Well, that's just because only one person can win.
Jeez, but yeah, so I understand that Chuck was there. But I'm just was listing where I met both of them individually. But Doc, where did you meet them both?
Well, I actually was very familiar with both their works before meeting them, because I think I've read the 1632 book like 3 times before I actually ever met Eric, because I really enjoyed it and I was really fascinated by it, and I read some of the gazettes and other things too. I'm not sure exactly which one of your books I read first, Chuck, but then I met them both at LibertyCon and got to know them also through my work with DragonCon, and just them being amazing people and actually willing to talk to the sidekick who was following around Jody. So
well, the good news is that it's for the first time, I think, in over a year, we've gotten. Well, I didn't meet them at a bar, so I mean, you should put that in your calendar.
Oh, there was definitely a bar involved. I've attended bar at LibertyCon.
No. These two individuals are much too dignified to go to your bar shenanigans.
Well, when it's hosting the book party or whatever, JR, it's okay. It's okay, JR. Just because you don't get out doesn't mean other people don't.
All right. So let's ask them the religion question. We see if they get to stay.
They do get to stay because they're awesome and amazing. So, gentlemen, we do 3 sci-fi properties: Star Wars, Star Trek, or Battlestar Galactica. Which one's your favorite?
I actually never really watched Battlestar Galactica, so I can't express myself on that. I tend to enjoy Star Wars more than Star Trek, but I approve of Star Trek quite a bit more than I do of Star Wars. I don't know if any of you read. David Brin has written essays on this, and I think David takes it too seriously, but what he says is, in fact, accurate. You don't want to look too closely at the Star Wars premises.
No, they fall apart.
Really, really don't. Just like you don't want to look too closely at the premises of Lord of the Rings, where the peasants always love the king, and you've got the wonderful nobility. And I have a friend of mine, Andrew Dennis, who's a co-author. He's often talked about writing a version of Lord of the Rings where the orcs and Sauron are actually the good guys and are trying to overthrow this grotesque medieval society. But nonetheless, Star Wars is a lot of fun. There's no question about it. And I enjoy Star Trek too, but I've always thought it was a little too tidy, I guess. And like I said, I never really watched Battlestar Galactica. So I will stop there before I get
Chuck, how about you?
any more trouble.
How many fan bases can you alienate in 5
Yeah,
minutes?
I know exactly.
It's like,
Okay.
we'll run that survey after this airs. So my first question would be, which Battlestar Galactica are you talking about?
I'll let you pick.
Okay, so if I'm allowed
like
to use
both.
the more, if I'm allowed to use the most recent one, and we ignore the last season, I will definitely say, in every regard, Battlestar Galactica. There's actually some attempt to obey physics as we understand it. I definitely agree with what Eric says, and while I'm not as I don't. David Brin is vociferous about many things, and this is one of them. And like Eric is saying, I would agree with the general premise. My attitude was, and I think I wrote this back in the 90s, nonfiction. There's a book called Rumors of War and Infernal Machines, if people want to read about the history of science fiction influencing technological development. Star Wars is really, I go to a Star Wars movie and I put my head in the same place as when I go to see a Marvel movie. You know, the bottom line is it's going to be, there's a reason it's called space opera, you know, and it's the opera, and it's there, you know, whereas Edna Mode says no capes, Star Wars says all capes. And so I think that so for me, if I was, it's a lot of fun, but frankly, if you look under the hood, it's a terrible thing to say about something that bills itself as science fiction. Maybe it's not a terrible thing to say, but I think there's probably almost as much plausibility or more plausibility in the Marvel universe. So that's there you go. And so yeah, it's definitely Battlestar Galactica. There you go.
Okay, wonderful. I definitely understand. I have to suspend the critical brain functions when I go to watch any of those kind of things as well. So now on to the fantasy ones: Sword in the Stone, Lord of the Rings, or the Chronicles of Narnia.
I'm gonna have to go Lord of the Rings here. I'm just I have issues with Chronicles of Narnia, which, you know,
I didn't think I'd stump Eric.
I just don't, you know, they're well written, but you know, they have a message, and it's a message I don't particularly care
It can
for.
be not your cup of tea is my favorite way of saying it.
Yeah, it's not. It's not. Lord of the Rings, I enjoy. When I first time I read it, I was quite young. I was, I don't know, 20 years old, 21, something like that, and I adored it. I read it since then, and I don't find I enjoyed it as much with further rereading. But it's it's certainly well, let's put it this way. My wife and I, Lucille and I, gave a copy of Lord of the Rings to our daughter Elizabeth when she was a youngster, and asked her to read it and see what she thought. And after she read it, she said, "Well, I enjoyed it, but it's awfully derivative." And we said, "Kathy, you don't get it. Everything else is derived from this." So that's part of the issue with Lord of the Rings, is it sets so many of the basic framework and trope of a certain type of fantasy, what's often called epic fantasy or sword and sorcery or whatever, that it's kind of hard to get past that. I just don't have the same reaction to Chronicles of Narnia. I just, you know, it just doesn't really do anything for me.
Well, Chuck, how about you?
So, Lord of the Rings, no doubt. I think it endures because it was the first of what it was, and it really probably doesn't have. If you want to say things improve on it, that's sort of like saying time marches on, and yeah, we learn a few things. But given what it was when it was crafted, without even, and the interesting thing being that it was never crafted with its ultimate, collective publication in mind, and certainly not the sort of cult following that it attained. I read it actually. I was about 12, I think. I can't remember if. I think I'd stumbled across The Hobbit in junior high school, and not only was it a fun story, a little bit simple but fun, but there were these cool maps in it, and it's like, and it turned out that there was a whole trilogy out there. I think that was probably the first time that I ever used the word trilogy. And I didn't get a chance to, but I don't think they had it in the library, if you can believe that, in a junior high school library. But lo and behold, I got sick. I had a fever that kept me home from school for about a week. And on the second day of that, I think my father showed up with with one of the incarnations of the book. Now, they really didn't know. God love them for trying, but it was the second. It was the Two Towers, but that didn't stop me. I just plunged on in, and little did I know that I got the best book first, because I do think that in the same way that sort of the second of the Star Wars movies, The Empire Strikes Back, is arguably, from my standpoint, best of the franchise. The Twin Towers is where you've got some of what I would say the most interesting byplay. The most is at stake. The outcomes are uncertain. All sorts of balls are in the air being juggled, and you don't know where they're going to come down yet. And so I then dutifully read 1 and 3, and I was hooked. And I think Chronicles of Narnia is they're fine. I don't, I guess my attitude is I don't, if message. Yeah, it's there. It's not how meaningful it is to me. That's a different issue. I find the Paralandra trilogy probably more interesting in a lot of ways. And for anybody who hasn't read the Screw Tape Letters, that's just a fascinating book, period. And as far as Sword of the Stone, I find T.H. White, he's the sort of author as a professor I would resist assigning. And simply because I find it's a little heavy going there at times. It's I don't know that his prose has aged that well.
I can see that.
Fair point.
I feel the same way about Faulkner.
About what?
Faulkner.
I don't think Faulkner.
Oh, no. I adore Faulkner.
Oh, Eric.
I like Faulkner too, but I like him for different.
But you were an English professor.
That's not. I liked him long before. I liked him before I was 17, and I discovered As I Lay Dying, and I said, "Wow, this guy is taking huge chances, and not all of them work. But the chances he took, he broke ground. A lot of people use Faulknerian methods, and they would be aghast to be told that, in fact, who kind of brought that into style. You're not going to like to hear it.
I think part of very resentful of my teacher who kept telling me I was using run-on sentences, and I'm like, they're shorter than his.
The advice I give people is part of the way people react to a given author is based on the book they first get introduced to that author, and all too many people get introduced in high school or college English classes with Sound and the Fury. Or maybe, if you're somewhat more fortunate, Absalom, or Light in August. But if you start with the Reavers,
that's a
you
very
will get
book.
Faulkner style and an opening to a novel that is hysterically funny.
I don't know. I just remember the guy's name was Fleming.
Anyway. So I always recommend, start with the Reavers. But I really do like Faulkner. I don't like everything by him, but there's a whole lot of things I do like about him. And on the flip side, the famous American author I really don't care for at all is Ernest Hemingway. And the reason is basically because the themes that seem to preoccupy him and the questions he wants to deal with are all ones that I'd pretty well settled for myself by the time I was 17. And, I just find him tedious after a while.
And there's a saying, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, that's it.
Just that there's a I will say that I think that if anybody out there is thinking of writing, approach if you think your avenue to that is through an MFA program, think very carefully. Then think carefully again, go to sleep, come back and spend a whole day thinking about that idea. But one of the good things that you can take away from that is this heard in one of those classes. I do not have an MFA. But it's like, first read Faulkner for the beauty and the novelty of language, and then read Hemingway to get it out of your system. So there's there you go. Whether that's wisdom or just waggishness, I can't say, but you've got it there now.
Oh, there you go.
That is good to know. I did not get an MFA, so I will accept that and move on.
Yeah, do save your money.
I only know two people who went about MFAs. One of them does write and writes very well, but I think that's just not the product of the MFA. And the other one, I really don't understand their writing anyways. But that's okay. We're not here to talk about educational choices. We're talking about sci-fi in this case. So what was your first love? Was it science fiction or was it fantasy?
Science fiction. I didn't even read any fantasy for the first science fiction book I read was Robert Heinlein's Citizen of the Galaxy, which my mother got for me when I was on my 12th birthday. And then I read Andre Norton's Star Rangers. And then I read Tom Godwin's, it was called The Space Prison or The Survivors, one or the other. I read a lot of Heinlein at that point and also a lot of Andre Norton. I didn't read Andre Norton's fantasies. I just wasn't. Actually, the first fantasy I can really remember reading was Lord of the Rings. And I did that just because it had gotten to be something of a cultural phenomenon by then. And also my uncle, Torgney, had told me when I was a teenager, he had read it when it first came out, and he loved it. And he told me, boy, you got to read this. And I didn't at the time, but I first heard about it from him. But no, I read science fiction pretty much exclusively. Now, I have to tell you, though, a bigger literary influence on me came when I was 16, I believe. I was working, my father had a ski resort back then before he went bankrupt with it. And I worked there in the summer, and the ski resort, the chairlift would run during the summer. Nobody's skiing, but, you could ride it all the way to the top, walk around, come back down, but it had a mid-ramp halfway through, and my job was to sit there all day and tell people, don't get off here, keep going to the top. That was my job all day. This is pretty boring. And it's a very small town in the area. I had gone through and finished all my science fiction books, and the two I could find in the drugstore at school. So I was kind of desperate for something to read, and there was a stack of Westerns in this little cabin I was working in, stacked up there, and I was under no circumstances going to read those damn things. But I finally just got desperate. So I read one, and as it turned out, it was Luke Short's Bounty Guns, which is very good, and Luke Short's one of the top authors in Westerns. But I became hooked on Westerns, and read a lot of them. And that really has influenced my writing probably more than anything. 1632 is a Western, if you know what to look for.
Oh yeah, no. My dad loved Westerns. He gave us
yeah, it's a collective protagonist. It's basically, the setting is a very classic Western trope. The ruthless, powerful ranchers are trampling all over the homesteaders, and into town rides the fastest gun in the West, but nobody knows he is the fastest gun in the West. And he gets attracted to a refined girl from the East. If you know what to look for, that's what 1632 is. So actually, my main literary influences are Westerns and the movies of Akira Kurosawa. Science fiction is the genre I like to work in, because it gives me the most freedom and latitude. But it's actually not really shaped the way I think of a story and tell one. Anyhow, I'm going to stop there. But fantasy was never. I eventually did read a number of fantasies, but it was never any. And actually, the first novel I ever wrote was a fantasy, but it was a very odd kind of fantasy. It was modeled after 17th century satires, and eventually got it published. It's called Forward the Mage, but that's a really kind of an oddball book. There's a kind of amusing story about that, which is that I got an agent based on that book because she really liked it. But she warned me, she said it's going to be a very hard book to sell. But she thought Dave Hartwell at Core Books might like it. And so she sent it to him. And David did like it. And he tried to persuade Tom Doherty, who was, the big shot at Tor Books, to buy it, and Tom would not do it. He said, no, it first of all, it's weird. It's the first book in a series by a completely unknown author. No, we're not going to buy it. And years later, I met Tom for the first time. And by then I was quite a successful author. And so I went up to him and introduced myself to him. And I told him this story of how he had rejected my first novel. And this is normally every author's sort of pipe dream of the day you can tell the editor first rejected you, But I actually thanked him, because that would have been a terrible book to start my career with. Because I would have been typecast forever as a really weird cult writer, kind of. And as it was, by the time it was my 12th book published, so, it sort of fit into a framework, but it's not really what people think of me as. I've always thought that story was funny anyway.
Well, I know I want to go read it. Now I'm going to go.
Well, you might want to read the companion book first. That's called The Philosophical Strangler. It's more accessible than Forward the Mage. One can be read as a sequel to the other, or vice versa. It's but the one I actually published first was Philosophical Strangler, and that was my third solo book published. I published it right after 1632, and Jim Bain thought I was absolutely crazy to do that. He said, you're batshit crazy. He said, you've just written a book that is a breakthrough novel for you. That's what you should be concentrating on, and form your brand, etc. Instead, you want me to publish this weirdo comic fantasy where the hero is a serial murderer? Seriously? And but I'd lived with that story since I was 22, because that's when I started writing it, 1969, and by now we're in 2002. So I kind of got stubborn about it, and Jim agreed to publish it. So.
And well, how about you, Eric? What was your first love, sci-fi or fantasy?
You mean Chuck?
Not Chuck. Sorry. I'm looking at Chuck, and for some reason I said your name. I apparently did not get enough sleep last night, gentlemen. I'm sorry.
I'll keep it short. Science fiction probably first, but that's because for me there was this thing called what was it called, the National Scholastic Library. So when you're in, I'm a child of the '60s, and that meant there were book fairs, and that meant there were all the sort of introductory books that were definitely what we would now consider YAs, and there were a bunch of those that were themed along the science fiction. It was the age of Apollo. I was very much, I had probably some adults probably thought a distressing amount of information about the space program at that age. And so that was a very big influence. I think the first really influential science fiction book I read, though, was War of the Worlds. And just first of all, because it's a fascinating book to me in a lot of ways, but I love the ending that H.G. Wells puts on it. That the protagonist says, that after the tripods had fallen, they went and they looked at the Martians, and at first they looked very alien, but as they started sort of looking at them more closely, they wondered, are they so very unlike us? And is this something we could become if our planet became cold and we became desperate? And is this what we would look like and what we would do? And I thought that was a very interesting thing, given how the actual impetus for the story, as he was out walking in the fields with his brother, and his brother was talking about how they were talking about Tasmania and all of the extinctions that were going on there, and his brother was sort of worked up and said, how would we like it if somebody came from another planet and started wiping us out? And H.G. Wells said, I think I've heard a winning story if I've ever. And so those were the major influences upon me, no doubt.
So I think that's actually still very pertinent to this day, that kind of question and answer of what would we do in that. I actually have my wallet has the book cover of War of the Worlds on it. And because I thought it was very apropos when I got it, and because I love science fiction. But what is it that you both love about the speculative fiction genre that draws you to this for your writing and reading?
Wait, say that again.
What is it that you love about this genre?
About it to write in it?
To write in it, but also you read it. So,
well, let me start with writing. You have way more latitude in science fiction. I mean, other genres place much greater limits on you. I mean, let's take mysteries. There's basically three characters in a mystery. There's the murderer, the victim, and the detective. That's basically it. And every murder mystery, and they're all murder mysteries. You almost never get a mystery about somebody who stole a car. It's somebody's got to get bumped off. And those are your three characters, and it's essentially endless permutations on that theme. And it's not that I enjoy reading them, but I don't think I'd want to be constrained to writing that way. And it's also the reason I don't write Westerns as much as I was influenced by them. I mean, the problem, again, Westerns, you got a lot of constrictions on you. And in science fiction, you have very, very few. And for that reason, also, publishers tend to give you a lot more leeway. Now, when I say give you a lot more leeway, that's only as long as you're selling. But still, that's more leeway than you're going to get most other genres. So I've never really considered writing in any other genre. There's crossover and I mix and match and stuff, but it's always basically what you can call speculative fiction or whatever. As far as reading it, I actually am less. Let's put it this way: I read much more broadly than I write.
Okay.
As far as fiction, I will read. I've read a lot of different kind of fiction, all kinds of, ranging from quote great literature to like I said, westerns, mysteries. So I science fiction is undoubtedly the single largest chunk of what I've read in my life, but it's by no means. Whereas in comparison, science fiction is all I've ever written. So that's kind of the difference for me.
And the
That's an
question
in-depth
again
answer.
is, the question is, I'm sorry.
How does your love of this genre transition into your both reading it and writing it? Like, what is it that you love of this about this genre?
Firstly, to catch us up a little bit, everything that Eric said, ditto, in terms of freedom, latitude, and the freedom to create worlds, to ask really big questions. And sometimes one of the latitudes is your ability to ask questions about this world without having to tie it to all of the shibboleths of the moment of this particular party or that particular policy or that. But you can ask the questions, and I'm not talking about the sort of things that are thin disguises of it's a rewrapping of something that's going on right now. I'm talking about something more like Brave New World, where there's a much bigger question being asked there about the methods and if you go down that path of as he says, as Mustafa Mann says early in the book, stability, everything. That's the key, stability. What happens when that becomes too driving? An objective. What dies? One of the things that we see die is art, unpredictability, passion, a whole lot of things, and the different mechanisms. And to me, that's just the notion that you can write a book and you can ask any question you want, and it does not have to come under the scrutiny of, yeah, but what does that mean about right now? And anybody who wants to put it there, well, that's not really apples and oranges. That's more like apples and Studebakers. So if they want to do that, they can do that. And the other thing is, there was a guy, I believe, who was asked about the space program and why he was so. This was a congressional hearing. It goes back to the right after World War II, I believe. How should we spend money on it? And somebody asked him. His name was Kittredge. Why are you so interested in this stuff? Why are you worried about what we're going to be doing 10, 15, 20 years from now? And Kittredge said, I'm interested in the future because it's where I'm going to spend the rest of my life. And I've often thought that that's why there's more than a little bit of futurist impulse in most of my hard science fiction. One of the reasons I try to keep it grounded is not because there's anybody who gets into science fiction thinking it's going to be predictive. That's a fool's errand. However, as what I would call grounded possibilities, that's really useful and really fascinating for me. So that's why I live there. I love the fantasy as well, but you're going to find even in my fantasy, when you see it, it follows a lot of those same sort of internal rules. It's not high fantasy where things come in, things go out, and how do they and where do they come from? Who knows? That's not my style.
Okay, that's an in-depth answer. I dig it. It's a good thing Doc is prodding me because I was so interested in listening, I forgot I was supposed to be the host. But
I have had this happen at DragonCon with both of them on panels. They're fascinating individuals.
Indeed. So many authors let their real-life experiences influence the kind of stories they tell. So was there any specific formidable moment that you think shaped you as a storyteller? And this time we're going to mix it up, and Chuck, you get to answer first.
Yeah, I think there is. It was a formative moment for me in a lot of ways. without going into the details of this very much, I was brought up in a family which focused a lot more on conventional religion than I do, and the magnitude of that understatement is pretty profound. And I went to see, it was in its first run, 2001 Space Odyssey, and I think it was Pentecost Sunday, strangely enough. And if you want to talk about a movie to take I think I was 9, 10, 9, 8. And, for me, although I loved the space part of it and was totally freaked out and terrified by the end of it, the thing that really stuck with me was how, and Kubrick was exactly the right guy as a filmmaker for the job. It was that first, dawn. Sorry for the sexist term, but that was the label on the film, the dawn of man. And there's a perfectly good explanation for not, how did we get here? Why did we prevail? And it was about weapons. And it was only later on that I learned, I mean, at 8 or 9, I didn't realize this, but by about 16 or 17, I realized the profundity of the fact that if you remember the sequence, they first use the bone to defend, to bring down game, and then to defend themselves against like wild animals, and then lastly to kill other apes at a waterhole. And in a spasm of triumph, the ape called Moonwatcher, I think, throws it up into the air, and it's a cut. That bone cuts to a satellite, but that's not just any satellite. That's an orbital ICBM silo. And we go from what would be, and remember, we were talking 1968 or 69, the first weapon to the last weapon in one cut. And for me, I just said all the things that you can do with narrative, all the things you can do with images. Sky's the limit. You can talk about all of time. And it jarred me, in a sense, out of what I would say was a path of accepting a lot of what I just received from my family as how the world is, where the world came from. And I didn't accept it quite so easily anymore.
It's a good answer. All right, and now to you, Eric. What was there any specific formidable moment that you feel like shaped you as the storyteller?
I can't. No, I can't actually think of any particular one. I was actually. It goes back a long ways with me. I mean, my first, I'll call it a novel, for lack of a better term, I wrote when I was 14. I say kind of a novel. There was no dialogue in it. There were no characters in it. It was simply a depiction of World War III. And then I started writing other books. By the time I was 16, I'd written 3 or 4 novels, and one of which I thought was good enough. I paid a professional typist $60 to turn into a real manuscript. That was $60 is a lot of money for a 16-year-old kid in 1963, 64. It was promptly rejected. So I can't actually remember a time where storytelling hasn't really been kind of part of just the way I look at the world. So I can't really think of any specific thing. And I will leave it at that.
Well, now we get to ask the fan questions, which are always ones I enjoy asking because they're fun. Have you had anybody do any cool fan art or cosplay one of your characters yet? We'll start with Chuck because we keep letting Eric go first. Chuck.
It was shortly after the second book in the Kane Riordan series that I got a bunch of essentially blueprints. Somebody sent me that, and then that became the basis of getting a whole bunch more done, which only appear to this day in the expanded edition of the first book, Fire with Fire, in the electronic version. So that was one very cool thing, and then I think the first time again, the first cosplay was at LibertyCon, Somebody came as one of the characters. He was named, if you know Christopher Robin, and he came as his character, whose nickname, of course, was Tig, for obvious reasons. And he came dressed exactly as that guy would have been dressed, so that was pretty cool. And it's been since then. And now Lost Soldiers, I mean, they're all from the latter half of the 20th century. I wouldn't even know. I mean, so many people are cosplaying that anyhow. I'd have no idea if they're doing mine or just because it's cool to do. So,
well, how about you, Eric?
And nothing really like that, but probably the single most, I don't know what you call it, striking or startling or unexpected interaction between me and one of my characters was early in my career. I wrote it wound up being a short novel for one of David Weber's Hunter Harrington anthologies, and one of the characters I developed was a character named Victor Kasha, who's a very edgy kind of character, and I modeled him after a Chekist in the Russian Civil War around the year 1919, which is a type of person most Americans don't know anything about historically. This is a period before the later NKVD and what people think of as Stalin's secret police. This was during the Civil War. And I was kind of nervous because I sort of didn't know how much people were going to like this character. David liked him, but, fine. But as time passed, I began realizing that he'd become kind of a cult figure, which startled the hell out of me. But I mean, a whole lot of fans, they had come up to me at conventions. I really like, and it's like, all right, it's sometimes characters will surprise you. You don't really know how people are gonna, react to them, and it's never stopped. I mean, it's been almost 20 years now, and in fact, he's a major character in this novel that's just coming out in 2 weeks. He keeps chugging right along.
He's older than some of my kids.
Huh?
He's older than some of my kids.
And I will say I had one other. After I wrote Philosophical Strangler, a fan came up to me at a convention a few months later, and he was very upset with me. He practically had tears in his eyes. And he said, I don't understand how someone who wrote 1632 could write a novel whose hero is a serial murderer. And I didn't say anything, but I felt like saying, it's a fucking comedy, for crying out loud, the humor went right by him. I mean, what Greyboar is in the book, he's the archetype of the working stiff that, hey, it's a job, it's cruddy work, but, pays well, works steady. And, what else do you get in life? And he's sort of the ultimate proletarian, you could think of him. And I wrote it precisely for the over the top, humor of it, but it just, I learned from that you never really quite know how people are going to react to what you read or what you write, and you will be surprised. Sometimes very pleasantly surprised, but you will be often surprised and sometimes taken aback when you realize let me put it to you this way. There's the book the author writes, and then there's the book the readers read, and those aren't necessarily the same book.
JR and I have this argument about Pern. He keeps telling me she wrote science fiction, but that's not what this is. So he has that argument with me weekly. So, but
I'll be back.
Okay.
Quickly.
So, Eric,
You just want to keep calling me Eric.
if it makes you feel any better, I kept calling my son after my youngest brother today too. It's a day. I'm still working off Dragon Brain. I'm really convinced. So, have you had anybody ask for your signature away from a convention or an official book signing?
I think only once or twice. And it was something I didn't expect, but it was still related enough. You know, it was at a it was something that I think was related to publishing, and I wasn't featured there, but somebody apparently recognized me. I don't know how that happened, but they did.
It's the hair.
And so that's the only stuff like that. So not a lot, no.
It's the hair. You have a good head of hair, which is not always the standard.
I don't know what that has to do with anything, but okay.
It makes you recognizable.
Oh, okay. Oh, ooh.
Not in a bad way.
I feel attacked.
No, but I mean, yikes! I don't know how many friends you lost there. You know.
I don't know. I saw a lot more people wearing hats at Dragon Con panels.
Okay.
You saw what?
That's got to be a
Cisca
way
was
to
being
come in.
harassed.
Huh?
She was being harassed.
She was mocking us. Hair challenge, the follically challenged. There we go.
JR. Okay. I was teasing Chuck that he's recognizable because he has good hair.
I used to.
All right, Doc, save yourself from yourself.
Got to go back.
Okay.
I'm gonna get a Nobel for my hair one day. I can see it now.
Oh my goodness.
Hurry up!
Okay. Eric, has anybody asked for your signature away from a book signing or a convention?
Say again?
Has anybody asked for your signature away from a book signing or a convention?
What do you mean? Does anybody ask for this? I'm not following you.
To sign a book. Just like
Yeah.
randomly, they're like, oh my gosh, it's you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, people ask. I mean, they set up signing sessions, but there are times people just come up to you and then ask you if you'll sign a book. Yeah, sure. I remember the first time it happened to me, I was sort of puzzled. It was like, well, no, I mean, it's like, why do you want me to, this is a job. I mean, I was a machinist, and nobody asked me. Well, actually, the management would give you a stamp with your initials on it so you could stamp the parts you made. But the reason was so they know who to blame if something was wrong. So, why does somebody, I mean, I don't know. I signed it, of course, but it always seemed kind of odd to me. Still does, to be honest.
So what's your funniest interaction with a fan?
My funniest? Oh, Jesus. I don't know if I call this funniest, but it was she was a fan, but she's also a dealer, and I'd run across her several times at conventions, and I liked her, and she came up to me at one of these conventions, and she said, "Eric, I really love your books, but something really bothers me." And I said, "What is it?" And she said, "Where are all the queers?" And I thought, yeah, okay. I hadn't actually ever thought about it, but we talked And I realized part of it was that there were books of mine she had not read, so that where that issue does come up. It came up more often than she thought. But I said, really, it's mostly just I don't think about them. And quite honestly, I mean, I just writers tend to write what they know about, and I'm sort of familiar with those subjects from a bit of a distance. My sister's been a lesbian, and I know friends are, but I'm not. So I said, however, I will make it a point in my next book to bring it in, because I think it's a good idea. So I did. The next book was called Time Spy, and I put in one lesbian and one gay character in it. But that was, I don't know if you call it funny, but I enjoyed it. I mean, it was just, and I liked the way she brought it up. I just, it was just.
Well, she was very point blank about it and very direct.
Yeah, very, very point blank. And she wasn't being confrontational about it. I mean, she wasn't sort of, she wasn't quite agreed, but she was just wondering, I mean, why is this? And, like I said, she had not read my first novel, for instance, Mother of Demons, which in one where the issue of sexual orientation is actually runs all through the book, but and she had not read Philosophical Strangler, where it comes up also. So part of it was just that she didn't know about some stuff. But I thought, okay, it's a legitimate question, and the honest answer was just because I hadn't thought about it. I mean, it really was no more complex than that. I enjoyed that interaction. I just, it was nice to I don't know how to put it, to run across a fan who actually read your books, cared enough about them, liked them, had something that was bothering her, that had to do, with something important to her, and just brought her up with you. And it's nice to have that kind of interaction with one of your readers. And like I said, I don't know if I call it funny, but
it's not funny, but I think it's a really awesome one, and it's an important one. So
I have tried to get better about it. There is a tendency, authors just tend to, it's the old story. You tend to write what you know about, and so it's real easy without really meaning to do anything. You just kind of drift, and it's worth thinking about that as you go along. So I try to do it since then, and I think generally successfully. It's kind of interesting because I find writing female characters very easy, and always have. There are a lot of stories, I think, and this is not some kind of political statement about feminism or anything like that, although I am a feminist, but that's not why I do it. It's just I think there are a lot of stories that work better with the point of view characters female. And I've, since I was a teenager, it just never seemed odd to me to write, stories with a female viewpoint, but I tend not to do that when it comes to sexual orientation. It's honestly not prejudice on my part. I mean, my sister's a lesbian, and so were two of my good friends, and it's never been an issue for me, but it just doesn't, something on my brain doesn't, automatically work that way. So I have to sort of give it some thought, where I don't really have to with women characters. So anyway, I'm just going to stop there. But that
okay.
I've always remembered that interaction.
Chuck, now that Eric's bought you some time, do you have a good answer?
It would have been actually pretty easy, because mine is as every bit as frivolous as his is serious and full of gravitas. I was in the back of an auditorium, slightly lately arrived, and somebody was talking about a book, that had won an award, and they were talking about that they were looking forward to it. They liked the book. They thought it had a terrible cover. Was I familiar with the book? Yes, I was. What did I think of the cover? Well, it has its merits. It has its merits, and this went on for a while, and the individual said, "When did you read it?" And I said, "Right after I finished writing it." So that was me arriving a little bit late for the start of the awards at where the Compton Crook was, where Fire with Fire won the Compton Crook at Balticon.
Oh my goodness.
What was the
So I think that
reaction from the
qualifies as a
person to
funny
that?
interaction. Pardon me?
What did,
It does.
what
What
is-
was the
Oh,
what was the reaction?
you know how you can see states of mind change microsecond to microsecond in the human face. It's when somebody is so stunned, they're not even aware they're stunned. Then they know they're stunned. Then they're horrified. Then they're looking at you to see what you're going to do. Then they realize you're smiling. Then they go through that moment of saying, is this a good smile or a bad smile? And then the smile turns into a laugh. Then there's the slightly nervous grin that turns into a matching laugh on their part, and all is well. All of which takes about 40 seconds for me to describe. It takes place in about 0.8 seconds, I would say.
That qualifies. We will take that answer.
I think I would go
All
and
right,
hide
so-
under a table. And I'm the person who accidentally looked at David Weber and said, I'm not here for your signature. I'm here for that guy's signature because I didn't recognize it was David Weber. And even that would be embarrassing more for me, and I'd not hide under a table. I probably would not have come out of my room the rest of the con.
Well, then think about all you would have missed. All right, so normally we would have you tell us everything you've written, but your bodies of work are so long that I promise you we will link to their websites where they will try to sell you all the things, and you can learn about everything they've written. So instead, we're going to jump right in to the 1637, No Peace Beyond the Line. So how did you guys come up with the premise for this story? You've talked about in other interviews, Eric, how you came up with the 1632 premise, but how did you specifically come up with the story idea for this specific novel?
Oh boy. Well, as is true with most things in a 1632 series, there's no great overarching plan. Things just sort of happen. In this particular case, in 1632, I introduced four young men. They're teenagers, 18. They're high school seniors, all of them, and they're buddies. And one of them becomes one of the major characters of the whole series. That's Jeff Higgins. Two of them wind up getting killed at one point or another, and the fourth one I originally just saw as a relatively secondary character. His name's Eddie Cochran, and but what happened was that when I wrote 1633 with David Weber, and I don't remember which one I was actually wrote the scene, but there's a scene where they attack Danish warships with a speedboat, with an American speedboat armed with rockets, and it's effective, but things go awry, and one of the young men, Larry Wild, gets killed, and Eddie gets his foot shot off, and the last we see him, he's about to crash into the boat, and so we assume he's dead. It's then discovered at the end of the book that he survived, so then I had to pick him up in the next book, which is Baltic War, and I hadn't given any thought to what I was going to do with Eddie when I had him get his foot shot off and dumped into the water. It just seemed kind of nifty. But the next thing I know, I've got another book to write, and so here's Eddie, and I don't know where I got the idea, but I thought, I know he's going to get a crush on one of the daughters of the King of Denmark. Um, and she's a king's daughter, not a princess, because her mother was, it was a morganatic marriage. Her mother was not nobility, and so she's not in line of succession. So that's why she's not officially a princess. She's called, their title is king's daughter, and she's the oldest daughter of King Christian IV, who, by the way, is an absolutely fascinating character. So then I got that romance going between them, and I had a lot of fun with that. He winds up which had been started by David Weber in a novella he'd written. He gets hooked up with Charles John Simpson, who becomes an admiral. And the next thing we know, because Chuck and I started working together, so we're kicking around what to do with them, and I have no idea which one of us came up with the idea. Maybe Chuck remembers, but we thought, let's send them off to the Caribbean.
Well, actually,
have adventures in the Caribbean, and we can steal a title from C.S. Forester. We can call it Commander Cantrell of the West Indies. That's where the origin of that novel got started. And
if I can add in
one thing just led to the next thing we know, we got to write a sequel to it, partly because we got a contract, but also partly because we knew where that was going to fit into something else. So we had to figure out a story, and it was Chuck who came up with the idea that they would intercept the Silver Fleet on the way in rather than on the way out. In other words, they would intercept it when the Spanish fleet wasn't carrying any silver. But they would do it because they would get all kinds of good stuff they needed for the colonies they were setting up. And plus they would, even though they wouldn't get any silver themselves, neither would the Spanish. And the Spanish, a whole Spanish kingdom relied heavily upon that annual influx of silver from the New World. So that's where that came from. And then it just becomes a matter of spinning stories out. Chuck and I are both very good at that. And I mean, that's not something either one of us, or certainly not both of us working together, has any difficulty figuring out. So that's kind of how it came about. I mean, there was no grand overall plan from the very beginning. It just kind of sort of, I mean, a lot of the books are like that. I mean, they just kind of one thing leads to another. It's one of the things I wanted to capture in the series, which I think we've done a good job of, is the I think there are real patterns in history. I don't think it's just chaos, but there is a lot of chaotic stuff happens in history where you just don't know, unpredictable stuff happens, and all of a sudden you got something completely different heading off somewhere.
I think Chuck wanted to add something at one point, Chuck.
Go ahead.
Well, first of all, Eric is sparing me because he's nicely leaving out one thing which makes me highly intentional. What I mean by that is there's something that what was going on was that David Weber, after having originally, as I understand it, as the contracts had to be changed, it was going to be Simpson going to the New World. Well,
yeah, I believe so. Yeah,
Simpson was sort of held back because David was leaving the series. I had kind of seen that as a likely occurrence, so I wrote this. If you take a look at the scenes involving the wild geese who take Trinidad and that entire sequence in the first of the Caribbean books, originally Eric, that was going to be the first thing of mine that Eric was going to publish. He had accepted that pretty much on one read, and he said, I like it, I'm going to use it. Before anything could be done with, however, the novel that was going to become the Simpson novel, that was when another planned dance partner sort of moved around a little bit. Andrew Dennis was not going to be able to do the next novel in the Papal series or the Papal arc. So all of a sudden, a novel that I had never heard of, it was at the perhaps ill-fatedly named Reconstruction, I think in 2010 or 20, I think it was 2010, 2009, 2010. And Eric said, we're putting that naval novel on this. Got to get this thing. We got to get this Papal novel done. It's like, okay. Meanwhile, however, it was clear that the wild geese, the Irish wild geese, found their way into that novel, although not the ones who wound up going to the Caribbean. So who was going to go to the Caribbean because it was unknown what was going to happen with Simpson. And Simpson was a heavy, and I think there was maybe thought that at some point maybe David would come back. I don't know. But I said, well, it would be kind of cool if they weren't actually going as an attack, but as a reconnaissance that turns into, oh my God, we're the fleet in being. And that was sort of the idea, because one of the things I really like to try to do, one of Eric's great mottos is be, essentially, first of all, vague is your friend. Second of all, writers love problems, and we do. And one of the best problems to, I think, give characters, which I think makes people root for them, and makes them interesting to write, is put them in a situation where they have a number of advantages, but they're short. They're shorthanded on almost everything else. They're scrabbling for their next meal. They don't have enough replacements. They don't have a safe port. They've got to answer all these questions. And the lineup between the Spanish and this tiny flotilla, comparatively speaking, that comes into the New World, just was filled with possibilities, which are still being played out in No Peace Beyond the Line. Certainly, No Peace Beyond the Line. We sat and we thought about some of the other things. It was kind of interesting because David and Eric and I all thought that one of the things that should happen is one of the big steamships, one of the most expensive ones, had to get destroyed. And that actually became a major, which is what you see blowing up in the background there, I believe. That is not some shell going off. That is, if you looked at that cover more closely, is an entire ship blowing to smithereens. And that, in fact, does happen in the book. And it's a kind of, how that happens is kind of one of my, you were asking earlier about stories in the book that didn't make it. That was one of the ones that I really didn't know exactly how that was going to happen. But I won't spoil it for anybody. But it was, and Eric liked the suspense of how is this going to happen? How are they going to manage not to let this ship fall into Spanish hands? But Eddie Cantrell is a pretty resourceful fellow, and proved it yet again. And it was also really, I think, the first book where the incredible. We've spoken about this, Eric and I, before. That combination, I think he was the one who mentioned it first the last time we were on, is when you have a balloon. I'm not talking about the ones that fly around. It's just something that puts you up in the air, and you either have a very, very simple wireless or just a telegraph cable going down. It changes everything. Forget the cannons, forget the steam engines. That sort of advanced lookout and that ability to always know what's going to happen first, whether it's where the enemy is placed or the weather that's coming, is just it's impossible to overstate how profound that is. And that was one of the other things that I think was in this book. The thing that, as I think I've said before, which I did not see coming, was that this became a sort of the relationship between the nature of the oppression of women as, if you will, chattel wives at the aristocratic level, at any rate, and this sort of the broad way that fit into the entire theme of slavery, of oppressed native peoples and everything, that rose up in, I think, kind of the best way that for me, which is that if I had tried to put that in, I'd worry about being heavy-handed with it. but it was sort of lying all over the place. And it was, and as it came about, I said, this is as much what this novel is about as anything else. And every once in a while, a novel surprises you. And I think I'm that sort of writer, and I think Eric is too. You go with it, and very often it takes you to your very best creative places. So.
Okay, I like that. All right. So I will link all these the books so you can check them out, dear listener. Can you hear me?
Yes. JR.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, JR.
All right, perfect. No, okay, so all of that, if that sounds interesting to you, will be in the show notes so you can dig it out yourself. But man, you guys are making us stay on our feet because you're answering them all out of order. But
that's great, because these are not the gentlemen where we have to pull out answers, and that's fun.
So
when you were conversation.
So when you were writing these, did you lean into the tropes, or did you just sort of let the story tell itself, and any relationship to the standard tropes was more incidental?
Say that again.
So some people, when they write, they intentionally lean into the tropes and they use that to sort of build the framework of the story. And I've noticed other authors, any relation to that is purely incidental, and they just tell the story as it needs to be told, as they figure it out. So when you two were writing, were you thinking about that? This is this kind of trope we're going to lean into, or did it just sort of happen?
Okay. I myself am a plotter. And I develop very detailed plot outlines before I start writing a novel, which is not something that came naturally to me, but I sort of learned to do it from David Drake, who was my mentor early in my career, because I find it both improves the novel and also, in the long run, speeds up getting it done. Chuck does the same thing, but doesn't do it the same way I do. And Chuck and I tell stories quite differently in some respects. And so what he and I have found works best is our working relationship. And this varies from one collaborator to another. David Weber and I, for instance, mix it up constantly. I mean, I was just rereading that book. My copy just came in, and I just reading it, and I'm trying to remember who wrote this paragraph. And it's some of it was me, some of it I think was him. That's how David and I work together. Chuck and I don't, because he and I actually tell stories rather differently. And so what works better with me and Chuck is he does almost all the writing when we get down to actually writing it. There might be occasionally something I toss in, but any book that's got my name and Chuck's on it, he'll have written 99% of the actual text. What the two of us do together is talk through the book a lot ahead of time. And that really often takes place over a period of years. I mean, because we're not just talking through one book. He and I talk about the series a lot and different ideas we have, so that by the time we're ready to start it, which means when he's ready to start writing, we both know quite well what we're doing. I mean, not necessarily in all the details, but broadly speaking. And so these are not, you hear people saying they write by the seat of their pants. No, that's not how we're doing books. Now, any book, there's always surprises that come up in the course of actually writing them. That always happens, but that's not the same thing as we know what's going to happen in the book, what the broad outlines of it, what the basic, elements of it are, and so forth. Chuck, you think that's a fair characterization?
Well, I just came back in this very second, so I have no idea what we're characterizing. I'm on my phone right now. My computer just it's not liking it.
In short, he was saying that you guys talk about it a lot, then he makes you write it all, and then he goes back and he edits you.
No,
Just like, wait, what?
We can just leave it that way.
That is not how I put it, but
no,
So,
I know a
Chuck,
bomb thrower when I hear one. She got that red hair, because it matches the temperament, I think. So
yeah, right, yeah.
Absolutely. So Chuck, when you write both the 1637, the No Peace Beyond the Line, and just in general, do you lean into the tropes, or is any trope that occur in your story more incidental to your writing process?
It's kind of hard to do this holding the phone. Let me see if I can find a different way to do this. Do I lean into the tropes? I don't know. I don't. The thing is, I find that if you become, I'm hesitant about formulaic writing, about anything that relies upon, well, go with the theme or go with the trope, or what's the conflict? Human versus human, human versus nature, human versus itself, that sort of stuff. I think it's a great way to talk about it at a sort of basic level, but I don't think it's a way to write it. So I kind of follow my gut as I'm looking at things, but I use what I guess I would say I use notions of tropes and conflicts and structures more to hone. It's not how I start. It's not how I start Rodin's Thinker, but it's how I'm going to chip it away to make it look like that. I think it was Rodin who they asked, it's like, how do you create these works? And he says, I just chip stuff away until it looks like what I want it to look like. And I try not to let I try not to let myself be too fettered in the initial story process, and then again when I'm writing the individual, I don't even know where the chapters are. I know what I think of them as beats more than anything else, and I know what I kind of need in the beat, but I do not plot out very strongly how I'm going to get there in terms of conversations. I try to leave a lot of room for me to discover it as I go, to sort of be inspired by what feels like the theater that's being played out in between my ears. And because I think my writing anyhow, I think is more fresh when I do it that way. If I'm working too close to a recipe, I don't think I'll make any mistakes, but I'm not in this game to avoid making mistakes.
Okay, that's a good answer. I like it.
Do you have any set bad guys in this novel?
Any what bad guys?
Any bad guys. Like, these are the bad guys.
Oh, yeah. There are huge numbers of bad guys in this novel.
Okay, can you tell us a little bit about any of them without giving away too many spoilers?
Yeah, one thing that...
Okay, go ahead.
One thing I was very pleased about the book is, and Chuck and Robert Waters did the same thing with their book they had come up with earlier called Calabar's War. There's no romanticization of pirates in this book. We depict the brutality of the time quite, I'll say, graphically, for lack of a better term.
Every novel in this universe makes me very glad to live in the century I live in. And it's not just every novel in this universe makes me glad to live in this century. Every single one of them, and it's not just for the plumbing.
I've forgotten where I got started with this, but
the bad guys, and you said they.
Well, see, here's the thing.
Pirates.
It depends what you mean by a villain. and this is true not just of this series, but pretty much anything I write. There are very few major characters who are villains as such in my fiction. There are some, but not many. Mostly they're the opposition, and they often have some rather unfortunate traits, we'll call it. But I try to make it clear that they're doing things for a reason. They're not just twirling their mustachios because they enjoy pulling wings off of flies and stuff. So Cardinal Richelieu is depicted that way. Wallenstein's depicted that way. There are many of the major characters, but then you run across other characters, and there are quite a few in this book. They're just thugs. I mean, there's no other really way to describe them. That's how we depict them. I mean, it's we're not really interested in the thugs' mommy issues.
And if I can pull 3 examples, we run into and Eric actually, I was afraid. Eric's initial reaction made me think that I had gone too far with the depiction of the pirate sack of Curacao, which is really it was intentionally, and as a matter of fact, I make reference to it. It's like it's a little bit like if you see those canvases by Bruegel, right? Where it's sort of like souls descending to hell, and they're those sort of big tableau sort of things, and this was the pirates given the imprimatur by the Spanish Empire to sort of root out, but root out meant rape, pillage, burn, torture, crucify, etc. And it was, it wasn't. How would I put it? I wouldn't say that the representation was prurient. It did not loiter on pointless details of what was going on, but it was meant to be disturbing. And actually, it was Eric who said, because there was one guy who was called Diego Grifo, who this was his breaking point. He was a person of mixed parentage to begin with. And when he leaves, Eric said, when he sees that there's that kid that we saw that was sort of crying against the wall, have him take that kid out, which I thought was, Eric is being a wuss. Eric, you were a wuss. No, but it was just that I think shocking a scene. Then you've got one of my favorite villains that I've ever written, certainly in 1632, a person based on a Frenchman, historical, by the name of Desnambuc. And Desnambuc is an absolutely ruthless operator who straddles the line between privateer and sort of national agent for France, but he loves his nephew. He absolutely loves his nephew. And so you've got that humanizing element in there, and then you've got there's another one historically based, Alvaro de Toledo, who is a Spanish commander who is definitely not on the right side of this conflict or history, but he's this sort of individual who's basically saying Spain is going to get us screwed. All of the problems back in Spain, all of the debauchery, all of the excess, all of the fact that they've never seen this or had to do this themselves. And he sort of sets out, okay, so what can we work with to get more even footing? Because if this goes on, we're in trouble. And by the end of the book, they've started achieving just that. As a matter of fact, in a strange way, Eric was talking earlier about one of the notions was that hitting the armada coming in, first of all, means you get all of the supplies. And the Dutch and the other allies are like, well, we can't eat gold and silver anyhow, so that's what we need. And they capture a lot of those ships. That was also very important. but the mere fact that now it's going to be a 2-year interval before Silver comes back, and this basically allows the at this point in the New World, most of the emphasis, the power, is sort of in Cuba for the most part, particularly because that's where all the treasure ships leave before they go overseas, and where they built ships in the New World. Historically, they'd been told not to, and this was the moment where the Spanish say, you know what? Oh, sorry, we'd listen to what you're saying, but we kind of have this situation, so we're going to have to build ships. Hope it's okay with you. And so there you've got this guy who's, quote, he's on the opposing force. He's not on the right side of history. He's not a great guy, but he's an absolutely capable individual who's determined to try to do right by his oath and by his side in a somewhat honorable fashion. So you've got this real rainbow, I think, a real spectrum of what it means to be a villain represented just in this book.
Awesome.
Okay, so you've mentioned both Eric and you, Chuck, mentioned some historic characters that you put into this novel. So when you wrote these historic characters, how true to the actual person did you stay when you were describing both their personality and just in general?
Go ahead.
Who do you want to start with?
Either one of you can answer.
Eric, go ahead.
Eric, how?
Okay, let me start with 1632. The two big villains there are Cardinal Richelieu of France and Wallenstein, the great, not so much great general, the great military contractor of Central Europe. But the reason I made them the villains was because I needed really smart people to make the thing work. And they were both extremely capable, smart people. And Schiller, in his plays, turned Wallenstein into a hero. I would not have any trouble writing an alternate history with Richelieu as not the good guy, but the hero. He was quite an impressive guy. And neither one of them did stuff just for the sake of being evil or anything like that. They had reasons why they were doing what they were doing. And that kind of continued on from there in succeeding novels. I mean, currently one of the big villains, we'll call him, is the Emperor of the Ottoman Empire, Murad IV. And he's often depicted in some histories as a kind of monster, but it's not how we depict him in the series. And that's just because I think it makes for a more interesting story than just, good guys and bad guys. There are some exceptions, but I think in all the novels I've written, the only major character I can think of who's just a pure villain is a character in the Belisarius series by the name of Vedanta Katra. And he's just a monster. I mean, the man has absolutely no redeeming qualities whatsoever. And I kept him alive for 5 books until I very lovingly and gruesomely killed him off in the 5th book. That was a lot of fun. No, I've been planning that for a long time. That's kind of the way the series generally reads. When you do run across people you think of as just straight villains, it's like the characters that Chuck's talking about in the, in this book. There are pirates, there are, you run across similar characters elsewhere, it's basically thugs. And there's, not much good to be said about them. But you can't do very much with characters like that. So, they tend to be kind of secondary.
You mentioned killing off. So I don't really, what?
I'm sorry.
So, Chuck, I was going to ask that same question. So, Chuck, when you and it doesn't have to just be the villains, but when you bring in characters that actually existed in history, how true to their personality and biography do you stick when you write them? Do you just
as close
start at
as
60?
historical record allows, and frequently the historical
Okay.
record is pretty thin. You've got some really important historical characters in this one. For instance, Admiral Tromp, and we have a lot of data on him. He wrote a lot, and a lot was written about him. A number of his admirals or the other officers there, same thing. The case of the Earl of Tyrconnell, Hugh O'Donnell. There's a fair amount on him too, and in each case I try to keep them pretty close to what we know. But you know, how can I put it? I'm not going to let that make me crazy, for the simple reason that, with the exception of Tromp in this particular novel, you're talking about one, maybe two biographical sources which are not very detailed. The Spanish at this time in this theater are far better documented. Although there you have the problem that, you know, in the same way that, as they say, winners write the histories. So you find out, you know, it's the winners who write the histories of the wars. In the same way, it's people in favor at court who wind up shaping biographies for good or for bad. And certainly that was very, very true. That was one of the problems with the Spanish court. So you have some of the characters that all the main Spanish individuals, even down to some of the sergeants. It was interesting because I was able to at least pull names out of historical records. I always tried to find a little bit out to give me that sort of sense of a connection to somebody who had some sort of traits that were identified in the historical record and put them in the place. For instance, there was a fair amount known at this time regarding the person who would be the Governor General of Havana in Cuba and also in Cartagena. Those two were pretty well-known individuals. So I used them as much as I could. And the Dutch settlers, they're all based on individuals who are out of the historical records. All of the individuals who come out of Recife and ultimately are settling in St. Eustatia. Once again, in one or two cases, we know a decent bit about them. In the other cases, all we know is who they were antagonistic with and their names, and maybe when they died. So it runs a gamut, really, in terms of how much information you have. So the less information I have, the less. Eric has a lovely saying about this series, which is, if only 5 people on planet Earth are going to know that you've got something wrong or you fudged something, don't worry about it. Just if it makes a better story, just go with it. And that's wise indeed. Because usually those 5 people who think they know better, the personality type there, I emphasize, they think they know better. And they very often tend to be the type of people, it seems to me, at great remove, they seem to be the type of people who look for opportunities to let you know that they know better. So I really haven't found myself overly constrained or concerned with the what I'll call the complaints about marginalia.
So
yeah, what I was trained as a professional historian, and to give an a man who was a friend of mine, I haven't seen him many years now.
I'll be right back.
And he's a professor at UCLA, which is where I'm in, of English history. His name's Bob Brenner, and he wrote a thesis about an important issue in British history, which is where and how did the capitalist class emerge in Britain. And it's prominent enough, it's called the Brenner thesis, and there have been books written about it and colloquiums held, and people arguing pros and cons on both sides. And a friend of mine was one of his research assistants and spent 2 years doing the detailed research of reading ships' manifests and stuff to try to, get all this out. And after 50 years, it's still being debated. Okay? So whenever anybody tells you, well, we know for sure, no, you don't. not something that's happened 300, 400 years ago. There's just too much data has gone missing. There's too much that's not quite clear, and you can. So that's why I don't get too hung up on details once you get down to
So
stuff that's obscure enough that it's very hard to know what it is. One of the things I do try to do when it's possible is use characters in the alternate history who died early, so that you don't really. For instance, a major character in the series is a Prince of Denmark, Prince Ulrich, and he's a major character in a number of novels. And the reason I picked him is that of the three sons of King Christian who were in line of inheritance, he was murdered in his early 20s. A very strange murder, was never solved. So nobody really knows anything about him. And so we can kind of shape him as a character kind of any way we want. When you take into account the fact nobody knows anything about him, he died young, and he's being cast into a completely changed history. So it's like, go ahead, prove us wrong. As much as possible, try to do that. You can't always do it. I mean, if you're going to work in this period, you're going to bring France into it, you got to deal with Cardinal Richelieu, and a lot's known about him. Same's true with Gustavus Adolphus and a lot of other characters. But you can fudge a lot of stuff, too.
So one of my favorite questions of the night kind of ties a bit into this and knowing who people are. But if your characters met you and they knew who you were, how do you think they would respond?
Inventing what?
If your characters met you like in a back alley someplace and they knew who you were, how would they respond? And all the things that you have done to their lives.
Depends who the character is. Some of them would be very pleased. Others, not so much. I could tell you one thing that I am finding amusing as time goes on is you will be surprised by now if you Google lots of historical data, especially of lesser known characters in this period of history. You'll often find the major reference that comes up as something from the 1632.
Yes, increasingly so.
It's hysterical. It's something. It's a phenomenon anthropologists are quite familiar with. It's a problem they always have when they try to record, because usually you have to do it verbally. Record, the traditional customs of a given tribe, and what they discovered was that they were often getting feedback from the natives who were figuring, what do these people really want to hear, and then they would come up with whatever they thought the story would be. That the European scholar would most find interesting. So you get some of that in this too. I don't know. I think a lot of the characters, most of them actually, I think would be okay. I mean, there would be some. King Charles would not approve of the portrait we do of him. Certainly. And most Spanish characters wouldn't, especially top characters. I think most of them would be interested at least, and wouldn't feel like it was just, a grotesque caricature. Let's put it that way. Of course, that's just my guess. They might run me through with a sword. I mean, hard to know.
I think actually, I'm sorry, go ahead, Eric.
Well, fortunately, it's never going to happen, so we're not going to find out.
Never say never. That's what I say. Anyhow, I would say that several of them would be very happy. And this is not just me. This is on a number of the characters that are probably amongst the downtimers, the ones native to the world of 1632, would be very grateful, and they would approach Eric or me, depending on who was responsible for this, because different of us were responsible for different things. They'd say, "Thank you for keeping me alive," as in Prince Ulrich, as in as in his younger sister, that the Danish king's daughter, who actually drowned in a moat. Another there were a couple of very mysterious deaths surrounding various of Christian IV's two at least of his offspring, and in many ways considered the most promising. So that adds extra spice and speculation to it. The Earl of Tyrconnell dies in a battle, and he goes. He has a very, very different life course that does not end well in actual history. A whole lot of individuals, I think, would be very grateful to Eric and to me that they're actually around. And as soon as they left, somebody like Desnambuc would come up to me, and he would be, I'm sure, fiddling around casually with the dagger and saying, "Now, I could ask you if you like silver or your life, but I would prefer to be shown in a slightly more positive light," which is pretty much exactly the way he would say it. Because, as is often the case, as shown, as used in so much literature influenced by these tropes, serpents very often have the smoothest of all times. So, so I think we get a very broad set of reactions.
Well, that seems very fair. So, can you give us a sneak peek of how the sausage was made? Were there any cool scenes or ideas you had to cut from the final books that you hope to find a way to use someday?
Wait a minute.
You got to tell them who you want to answer first.
Well, okay. Well, Eric, what I was saying was, can you give us a sneak peek about how the sausage was made? Was there anything that you guys wrote for this book that you ended up having to cut for the final product that you want to use in another book?
Possibly, but I think I'm trying to, Chuck can correct me if you don't agree. I think most of what we cut from this book was sort of duplication. I mean, stuff that was just kind of, we didn't need it. And I'm not sure it would be suitable for the basis of a different, I mean, the other material that we've taken out of stuff we have used, but I'm not sure there was anything in here. Can you think of anything, Chuck?
Yeah, well, I think the thing you're talking about, that was the part at which actually got written, which I would call the ongoing woes of Sophie the Misfortunate, which Eric said, you got to lighten up on this, Chuck. We get the idea that this poor woman has just been through a terrible time. Take some of that out. It was a really good suggestion. Some of the things that got cut earlier got cut simply because the book became immense. There was originally planned for the book something that will happen in War to the Knife, which is the Spanish attempt to eliminate the Uptimer base the Dutch Uptimer base in St. Eustatia. But there are two things. There's a very long range Uptimer cannon that has been decommissioned. It's useful again, but they don't have the mount for it. It actually was a much bigger gun than it was a gun they took off of one of the ships. And what the trick to this is that you have radios now and you have telegraphs. You also have something which is called an aquilator, which we owe to Rick Boatwright. Normally, I would not give this away, but in order to remember Rick, who we lost to pancreatic cancer not more than 2 months ago, or not much more than 2 months ago,
Yeah.
The aquilator was largely his baby. The idea of, can you make a computer that works basically on fluidics, to trip circuits, to use the sort of calculation process of, if you will, gates and flows instead of electron flows in wires. Well, as I know I'm dealing with two veterans here, so all I'm going to say is, if you've got a long range weapon with a rifled barrel that actually never gets a chance to be used to its full potential because of sighting issues, but you have good long range optics, and now you have range markers in the form of buoys, and you have a computer, you know what? You're going to be doing things with shore artillery that are absolutely beyond the level of expectation and comprehension. So there was a defense of St. Eustatia that did not get shown in this book, Oranjestad, but thanks to Rick Boatwright and what he gave to the series in so many ways, it's all but written. I mean, I've got it. I was ready to go with it, but I looked at the word count and I said, nope. And it works. It will work actually probably even better in the next one. But as Eric said, I don't think either one of us have a problem with coming up with stories. And at the end of the day, it's usually we enjoy the feast rather than the famine. And that gives us more stuff that we push forward. And when we push it forward, it may get repurposed a little bit, but usually it tends to age well and often be improved by the extra time and consideration, I think.
Okay. All right, Doc, you get to ask him the fun tech question before we wrap it up, because we're almost at 2 hours.
Well, normally we ask about what tech you'd want, but since this is alternate history, what tech, if you were back in 1637, would you miss the most?
And
Eric,
you can answer first.
What would I miss the most?
What technology would you miss the most if you were trapped in 1637?
All kinds of medical stuff. For sure. I think that's it, really.
Modern medicine? It's a good answer.
Yeah, it's
a critical one.
I'm at the age now where you are much more conscious of this stuff than I was, 30 years ago. And how many ways that modern, it's not just medicine, it's medical care and knowledge and a whole panoply of stuff. Makes your life both tends to make it longer, but also tends to make it less painful or stressful, whatever you want to call it. So I think that'd probably be it. I would say modern plumbing, but we've already established in the series that they can take care of that. Not, most people don't get it, but it can be gotten. So I would say the one other thing, because I once spent a summer working construction crew up in the mountains of California, where I was sleeping with the rest of the crew. There's three of us literally in a log cabin that had no running water, only a wood stove to cook on, and an ice box, and no electricity. And I like to read, and reading at night with no electricity is a royal pain in the ass. It can be done, but if you've never lived without electricity, you don't quite grasp what a pain in the ass it is. So that would be one other thing.
All right, what about you, Chuck? What would you miss the most if you got
so Eric
back
took
into
medical,
1637?
and that's one of the ones that I would miss, and not just for myself, but I mean all the when you have kids, and at particularly back in that time, the number of ways, there's a reason why mortality was so high at the two extremes of the age bell curve, and I think the daily terror of a parent. because if I go back, I'm not sitting there because I'm who I am, but I think also because we're post Nietzschean and post Kierkegaard. We're not sitting there saying, oh well, it's I would go back, I would not go back and have all of a sudden magically the mindset that this is part of some grand plan unfolding. I'm thinking I'm going back with my mindset, which is that's my child. I want to save my child, and I can't do it anymore. And I have
Right.
and I may have more knowledge in certain ways than the doctors of that time that would be productive to that. And of course, no one's going to believe me. I would say that just on the level one, and I touch on this actually in one of the scenes in No Peace Beyond the Line. There's another historical character who wrote one of the largest treatises on the natural the plants, the flora and the fauna of Brazil and South America. He was also a physical doctor. He was a Morano, so he was a covert a Jewish person who was covert in his Judaism. His name was Brindao. And Brindao, in this case, is alive and well, old. But what he says is one of the biggest things you've done is we used to have all people in different parts of the globe, doctors. We see the same things, but we call them by different names, and we've observed different features. He said, your high school library has presented. We all now can speak the same language. We all have this sort of this basis of data that allows us to talk and to know what to look for. What we've seen it in different places. So this medical thing is I think a very real issue. Probably there's two different answers I'd give to technology. One personal and one social. Personal because I'll see it day by day, minute by minute, which is I wouldn't miss this. I would not miss social media at all. I wouldn't. But I would miss the ability to do what I've been able to do the past 4 or 5 years when my son has been in Italy in the Army, or we're traveling someplace and we want to talk to our kids or friends. That ability to get a phone and speak to the other side of the globe, to the people we love, to the people we care about. Not having that, I'd miss that. Not that I want to use it every day, not that I do use it every day, but I like to know it's there. And that connects to what I would call the big picture item, which is I would miss the technology, this is going to sound weird, of mass production. Because when you have to produce everything individually without any replaceability of parts or interchangeability of parts, every resources, good things are rare and people are going to fight over them. I mean, I'm not saying that people won't fight over good things anyhow. God knows we've got people doing that now. But when you can make more objects that can make life better, at least you can begin to attack some of the problems of want that are so prevalent at this time. Those are the ones I'd miss.
That's a philosophical answer to close this out. So if you want more, we will link in the show notes all of their social media, their contacts, a Wikipedia page for 1632, and the bibliography if you want to read it in order. But as we wrap this up, Eric, can you tell listeners and viewers how they can find you?
Well, if you want to run across it, I'm probably on Facebook more than anywhere else. So I have a Facebook page. You can always come there. I'd say that's probably the best way to run across me. Well, you can come into Baines Bar too. I show up there, but that's and I do have a website. It's ericflint.net, but I'm not there regularly. I'm in a post on it, but I'm not. It's not a place I hang out, so to speak. So I think that's about it.
All right, and what about you, Chuck? Where could listeners who want to connect with you find you?
And as I find myself eating my own words, why on social media? Thank you for that one-liner, JR. That was a great setup. But but frankly, the best place to find me is on my really astoundingly lively, I say because I'm not the one mostly responsible for it, group page on Facebook. And there's probably there's at least a couple. I would say there are at least half a dozen posts a week, and sometimes you get hundreds. Literally, the threads go on and on and on. So there's a lot of activity there. Most of the conversation probably follows around my science fiction series, but it does work a little bit outside that, and we're and the moderators and administrators are very good about making it a welcoming place for all. That's the place to find me.
Okay. And you can find us on our website at anchor.fm/blasters and tech blades, anchor.fm/blasters and blades, Twitter at SF_fantasy_show, Sierra Foxtrot _fantasy_show. We do have an email address, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. We promise we answer it at least once a year. We do have a Facebook group where all the shenanigans happen, facebook.com/groups/Blasters and Blades Podcast. Again, facebook.com/groups/Blasters and Blades Podcast. And finally, you can support the show over at buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Put in the comment section that it is for the podcast, and I will keep Doc Cisca and Nick Garber duly intoxicated. They will drink until their liver surrenders.
No such thing.
Or, as we always say, you can also support us over at anchor.fm/blasters and tech blades, where they have a Patreon type model that you can have a reoccurring subscription there. All of the help is duly appreciated. The year is for us is about over for our podcast season 1, and with your contributions, you help pay for the overhead. So we had a net neutral, which is all we hoped to do, and we greatly appreciate all of you that contributed.
So thank you on behalf of Nick Garber, who is busy doing his day job and drawing me some new comics. J.R. Handley, I'm Cisca. This was the Blasters and Blades podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time, same place. We're indulging our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, picking on J.R., things that go boom, and of course, all the good books.
And pineapple doesn't belong on pizza.
It does.